Clone consoles are a staple in the retro gaming community. Love them or hate them, they're here to stay. Nothing will ever beat playing on an original system, but if you have an NES, I guarantee you've got some weird problems. You gotta finagle the cartridge in there, you gotta pull it out with a wrench, or you've had it repaired once, maybe twice, multiple times. And how many systems do you have cluttering your shelf? Do you look like this? That is an insane amount of cables that you've got to manage. Clone consoles are cheaper alternatives that offer a lot of quality of life improvements over playing on original hardware. And one of the most appealing features that these clone consoles offer is multi-cart compatibility, the most infamous of which being the RetroN 5. This puppy plays NES, SNES, Genesis. This puppy plays Famicom, NES, SNES, Genesis, Super Famicom, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on one console with one HDMI cord. We've done an in-depth video on the RetroN 5, so go check that out if you haven't already. But today we're focusing on the ClassiQ III. ClassiQ III? I don't know how to say it. I've always said ClassiQ, but I think it's supposed to be Classic. I don't know. This puppy is a brand new clone console from Old Skool that plays NES, SNES, and Genesis games, all in 720p HD. We'll be comparing it to Hyperkin's equivalent, the RetroN 3, which plays all the same games and serves the same exact purpose on your shelf. So I'm going to try and answer the question which one you should buy. But before we get started, if you enjoyed this video, if it helps you make your decision, leave us a like and subscribe. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss any more awesome content from us. And if you have either of these systems, leave us a comment and let us know. This video was not sponsored by Old Skool or Hyperkin. We did not receive these consoles for free, and we have purchased them ourselves wholesale for sale in our store, Nostalgic Video Games. Both of these consoles are currently available for purchase in our store and on the company's websites. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So right off the bat, the ClassiQ III's box is much bigger than the RetroN 3, proudly touting that HD 720p, an aspect ratio and region switches, 2 controllers, AV and HD output, and cartridge compatibility. Boxes on both of these are pretty standard. They show off the products and give you a little rundown of what to expect. Once you get both of these out of the box is when you really start seeing the differences settle in. The ClassiQ III has this sort of hybridization of the Super Nintendo and Genesis designs. Kinda neat, kinda weird. The RetroN 3 continues Hyperkin's sort of design language here with this simplistic geometric box look with one cut edge with the Hyperkin logo and these little ridges along the top. But in the end, visuals are really just down to personal preference. I really like the colors and the translucent plastic of the RetroN 3 HD. I really miss when companies would just mold everything in translucent plastic. If I look at something and my brain tells me that I can eat it, it makes me want to buy it that much more. But I do think there is a lot of merit to the artistic design of ClassiQ III's. It has the sort of Super Nintendo raised ridges here with the power and reset buttons, but then has the Genesis Model 1 look with the big old round spot where you stick the cartridges in. I appreciate the color coding, but I don't know how I feel about the big primary swaths of red, purple, and blue. It doesn't speak to me quite as much, whereas the RetroN 3 is a bit more cohesive. But one of the biggest, most important differences to me about these two systems is the location of the controller ports. The ClassiQ III has all NES, SNES, and Genesis controller ports all along the front here. That is fantastic. It is a little cramped, so you might not be able to have all of them plugged in at the same time, but that shouldn't really be an issue with the way that they're ordered. The RetroN 3 tackles this a bit differently. We've got 2 Super Nintendo ports on the front, 2 Genesis ports on the right, and the NES ports on the left. That's one of my biggest complaints with a lot of Hyperkin's newer consoles, especially the RetroN 5. Having all the controller ports along the side is really inconvenient. I know a lot of people, myself included, have those IKEA block shelves that have all of our consoles nice and spaced out on them. So if you set this on a bookshelf or a shelf that's sectioned off into cubes, I know the shelf that I have my RetroN sitting on is just barely enough space on each side for clearance. So when you plug your controller in on the side, you bend the crap out of the cable right where it connects to the port. And that really stresses those cables and has me concerned for the longevity of the controllers I use. One of the biggest appeals to me about clone consoles is that these are new hardware. You don't have to worry about putting the wear and tear on an original console or controller. So when there's something like that that seems to compromise the longevity of the console and the accessories, that really irks me. So I definitely think that the ClassiQ III handled the controller ports much better. Comparing the power and reset buttons, the ClassiQ III works just like the Super Nintendo. It's a little slide switch, but it has 4 notches: off, Genesis, Super Nintendo, and NES. Now why they didn't make the lights and labels line up with the arrow and the switch really just bugs me. It doesn't affect the usability or anything, it just annoys the shit out of me. Reset button sits right here. They got these big chunky buttons. On the RetroN 3, you have these smaller power and reset buttons. I like the homage to the Super Nintendo with the ClassiQ, but these RetroN 3 buttons do feel a little better, even if they are smaller and more inset. The RetroN 3 also has a separate switch to choose between NES, Genesis, and Super Nintendo, instead of that being incorporated with the power switch. Both ways work, doesn't really bother me, really up to personal preference there. Now the back of the consoles is where some really interesting differences appear. Both of these have AV and HD ports, which is fantastic, especially if you have multiple consoles set up and don't want to swap cables around, so you can choose which format you use. Both of these use a micro USB cable for power, which I prefer USB-C because those cables don't wear out nearly as much, but I guess micro USB is cheaper. I don't know. And they both have 16:9 and 4:3 aspect ratio switches. That's nice if you are wrong and prefer to stretch your games. Blech, that's just me. But that's great that it's built into these consoles, so you have the option. Now the ClassiQ III also has an LED switch, a U and J switch, and a P and N switch. The LED here that circles around the entire console. It's a really nice touch, and it's fantastic that you have the switch. Sometimes if I'm playing in the dark, those lighting effects can really bug me and end up being really distracting. So I'm glad that that is built in. Though I do think I prefer the simplicity and class that just the one lit up Hyperkin corner adds. Yeah, the big long bar is cool, but really is it necessary? Now these U, J, P, and N switches are for specific Genesis regions. You've got United States, Japan, and you've got PAL and NTSC. For the Super Nintendo and NES, you've got this switch back here on the bottom of the console for PAL and NTSC. It's really weird. I don't know why it's on the bottom of the console. That's really, really weird. Because if you have a collection that has cartridges from multiple different regions, every time you're gonna have to pick up your console and flip that switch when you wanna play a different cartridge. It's weird, I don't know why that wasn't included on the back, just something to point out. It's even worse on the RetroN 3. There are 3 switches on the bottom of the console. I don't know if it's just because it was cheaper to produce the boards that way or what. That's just really inconvenient design. The switches on the RetroN 3 are nicer, they're inset, and they feel really good. The ClassiQ III switches are kind of these small rounded ones. They're, you know, my fingers kind of slip around on them. I don't like those switches as much, but it's nice that you have most of those region switches on the back of the console instead of on the bottom. Now the last major difference I want to point out is the depth of these cartridge slots. So on the ClassiQ III, the NES cartridge fits down a little bit past the label. It covers up a little bit of that art. But it's nice that this doesn't have a death grip. A lot of these clone consoles and replacement pins are really, really tight, which usually Hyperkin has a pretty bad issue with. But I'm happy to say that the RetroN 3 isn't nearly as bad as some of the other consoles. The one difference being that you really kind of have to get it just right and add some intense pressure to get that down there. Feels kind of sketchy. I hate doing that, especially if you've got like a copy of Earthbound or something that you're just jamming in there. Kind of concerning. The ClassiQ III, it slots in a whole lot easier. It holds it tight, but it comes out. Isn't that hard? The Super Nintendo slot fits in a little better. The only thing I'm worried about is that with the NES cartridges, if your label's a little peely, you can wear out that label a little bit on that edge. Whereas with the RetroN, it isn't even close to hitting that label. That's pretty much it going over the aesthetics and physical features of these consoles. The one big thing that separates these, in my opinion, is plastic quality. Hyperkin does a really good job at making their consoles and controllers feel premium. This feels like a console. The ClassiQ III kind of feels like a plastic box with a motherboard in it. It's not that the plastic quality on this thing is bad. To me, I think it comes down to texture. This matte black has this weird kind of texture to it, and it shows fingerprints and little blemishes a whole lot more than I expected it to. Whereas the RetroN 3, the translucent but smoother matte, doesn't really show all that much. I don't think either of these consoles' shells will bust or break on you, but it is worth noting that the RetroN 3 feels a little better. It's also worth noting that the RetroN 3's MSRP is $10 more. In the end, not all that much, but it does kind of end up feeling a little more premium. The next thing I want to talk about is the controllers. Both of these consoles come with 2 controllers. I love that. Most people who buy these consoles are going to want to play with friends, family, or kids, so having them come with 2 controllers is fantastic. Hyperkin opts to give you their versions of the Super Nintendo and Genesis controllers, the Scout and Squire. If you've watched some of our other videos, you'll know that I really like the Scout. Hyperkin controllers always have great build quality, and the buttons feel fantastic. Both of these also update the classic designs to homogenize them with Hyperkin's art language. You got these ridges, and you got these nice geometric shapes. They look nice, they feel great, and they play great. Old Skool decided to make an entirely new controller for the ClassiQ III, and it's weird. Looking at it, you can tell that it's sort of this weird hybrid of the Super Nintendo and Genesis 6-button controllers, but with the more modern controller prongs down at the end for added comfort. Holding this thing feels odd. I've got big hands, and these are just a little too small. The prongs don't come out quite far enough, and I feel like I have to hold my wrists at a weird sharp angle. And these buttons are just slightly too close together. I don't know. I'm not entirely sold on this thing. You've got your D-pad, your shoulder buttons, your A, B, C, and X, Y, Z, as well as start and select. You've got everything you need, but these buttons feel a lot more clickety than the nice, smooth Hyperkin controllers. They also use the Super Nintendo port, and they have a switch on the back of the console to switch between Nintendo and Sega. In the end, I think the thought and intention is well placed, and it's there, but the delivery just kind of falls flat for me. They're serviceable, you'll be able to control your games with them, they're just not for me. But the cool thing about both of these consoles is that you can use any third-party controller or any OEM controller in those ports. So if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. In the controller category, I definitely have to give it to Hyperkin. Yeah, if you want to play two-player Genesis games, you're going to have to go out and get another Squire or Genesis controller. Same goes for Super Nintendo. But it's still nice to get new, modern updates that still feel classic for these controllers. So the point definitely goes to Hyperkin here.
So here we've got the ClassiQ III and the RetroN 3 all fired up playing Super Mario Bros. And as you can see, the ClassiQ III on the left is quite a bit more saturated. The colors are really bright and vibrant. It doesn't look bad, it's just a little weird. The RetroN feels a bit more right to me, but there's still just some like weird things. I don't know if it was the way that the capture card was working or whatnot, but there's that like one blue line along the bottom. I did want to note though that playing with the ClassiQ III controller felt a bit more floaty. It wasn't quite as responsive as the RetroN controllers. I was using the Scout here. So it was a bit interesting just feeling the different ways that these consoles and controllers actually control the games. Another thing you note is that there is a switch on the front of the ClassiQ console that lets you switch between using the SNES port for all consoles or using the console-specific port that you gotta switch if you use that ClassiQ controller on the Super Nintendo port or not. Now here's a comparison between the 4:3 and 16:9 aspect ratio switches on both consoles, as well as audio comparison. Now here's a comparison between a Super Nintendo game. We've got Donkey Kong Country 2. Now that saturation on the ClassiQ III continues here on the Super Nintendo port. It's a little more subtle here than it was in Super Mario Bros, but it is still noticeable. And I didn't really have any trouble with this game. I played for quite a while and had plenty of fun. This one seemed to control a bit better with the ClassiQ III controller than Super Mario Bros did. I didn't really notice all too much of a difference. I don't know if that was just because this is actually a Super Nintendo game and using that Super Nintendo port or not. Just something to note. And last but not least here, we have Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis. This one has the least differences I could spot. I think it is still just a bit more saturated, but it's not quite as easy to tell here. It's probably just because of how fast you're going in a Sonic game. The visuals both look great, the music sounded great on both systems. The audio on both of them seems just fine. In editing this video, I was able to tell that the RetroN was a bit louder than the ClassiQ III, but there really wasn't all that much of a difference in quality to me. Just with the nature of clone consoles, they'll never be 100% the exact same audio or visual quality as the original console or as each other. But despite the subtle differences that these two have, they both play and work great.
So that was the ClassiQ III from Old Skool and the RetroN 3 from Hyperkin, and in the end, they're both really comparable systems. There are slight differences between the visuals and the sound. Just with hardware differences, these clone consoles are never going to be 100%. There's always going to be some incompatibilities, some weird little idiosyncrasies with the audio, some weird bugs. The ClassiQ does boast homebrew supports. It's definitely worth looking up your game specifically and seeing, because sometimes these clone consoles just don't do great with repros, multi-carts, and whatnot. So it's really on a case-by-case basis there. But every game I threw at these, they played just fine. I do want to say that the RetroN 3 played a little better, but honestly, that's down to the controllers. Both of these consoles are really comparable, and it's kind of a toss-up which one I think is best. I think some of the user-friendly design here, with all the ports on the front, is really a point in ClassiQ's favor. The RetroN 3 does have nicer controllers, but both of them pretty much play the same. So it just comes down to personal preference. Personally, I like the RetroN. When it comes down to personal preference, it's really just aesthetics at that point, and I really like Hyperkin's design. So personally, I'd probably go with the RetroN 3, but both of these are fantastic budget options. So if you enjoyed, thanks for sticking around. So if you're considering picking one of these up and you're in the Northern Kentucky area, stop by Nostalgic Video Games. We'd love to see you. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe. It goes a long way to show us your support. We've got lots of awesome stuff on the Nostalgic Network, and we've got lots of cool stuff coming in the future. We also just opened up our Redbubble store. So we've got shirts and stickers and lots of cool designs on there. We also have the Booty Hunter collection, which are some art pieces that I did myself of bootleg Kenner-style Star Wars action figures. We got Boba Fett, we got Borsk, we got Mumgar, IG Rodeo, Succus, and Forlop. And that Redbubble store is the best way for you to support us directly. All of the profit from that store goes right back into making content for you guys. So go ahead, order some stickers, slap them on your water bottle, your bumper, your friend's face, posters, all sorts of cool stuff on there. It would mean the world to us to check it out. That link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.